A note before this one begins. If you've been listening along on the long drives, or in the last hour before sleep, the audiobook edition of the previous collection is now stitched together in one continuous read, narrated in the same voice you're hearing now, and it lives quietly wherever you keep your audiobooks. It isn't a sponsor. It's just there if you want it, the way an old lamp is there in a hallway you already know. There are ridges in the Southern Appalachians that never quite went to sleep. The maps stopped marking them a long time ago, and the surveyors who tried had a way of getting turned around before noon, so the ridges kept their old names in the old mouths only, and the new mouths learned to say the new names or to say nothing at all. People still cross those ridges. People still climb them for hickory and ginseng, for a shortcut between two hollers, for a bit of view on a Sunday. But they don't linger. They don't sit down for a meal up there. They don't set a fire above a certain elevation. They don't answer if the wind seems to speak first. That last one is the one they'll tell you about if you ask kindly and don't press. They just don't answer back. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from tonight. A porch, a truck, a kitchen, a bed in a room that isn't quite yours. I read every one of them. It surprises me every time how far this voice carries, and how many of you carry stories back, and I want to hear them. I really do. The story I'm about to tell you was collected in pieces, the way most of these are, from a bound ledger kept by a country doctor's widow, from a Cherokee elder who was willing to sit with me for 2 afternoons and then told me, gently, that she had said enough, and from the margins of a Bureau of Indian Affairs land report that was filed once and never filed again. I have set it down as honestly as I can. The names have been kept where the families gave permission, and softened where they did not. The year was 1907. The place was a long, uneven ridge east of the Oconaluftee, in the North Carolina Smokies, a country of laurel hills and old growth and creeks that ran clear and cold even in August. The ridge did not have a name on the surveyor's map, or rather it had 3 different names on 3 different maps, none of which agreed. The Cherokee who still lived in the coves called it something older, a word that carried a warning inside it the way a hollow tree carries a wasp's nest, and the word was not to be spoken lightly in the presence of children. Our man was Harlan Doss, 41, a broad-shouldered timber cruiser with hands that had done everything hands can do to a tree. He had a heavy jaw softened by a beard he kept short, dark hair going the color of iron at the temples, and gray eyes that looked at a stand of oak the way another man might look at a ledger of accounts. He was not a cruel man. He was a careful one. He wore corduroy trousers cinched with a leather belt he had cut himself, a wool shirt washed too many times to be any true color anymore, and boots that had been resoled twice by a cobbler in Bryson City who owed his father a favor. When he walked heel first, quiet, the way a man walks who has been shot at more than once by a startled hunter. Harlan had a sister named Ada, 29, thin as a reed, with the same iron gray at her temples 10 years too early. Ada was the reason Harlan cruised timber. Ada's husband had gone to Kentucky for railroad work in the winter of 1905 and had not come back, and had also not sent word, and had also not sent money. Ada had 2 children and a leaking roof and a garden that the deer got into every summer, and Harlan had a strong back and no wife and no children, and so the arrangement was simple and unspoken. Every dollar he earned above his own eating went into a tin box under Ada's kitchen floorboards. He had promised their mother, on her deathbed, that he would see Ada through. He had not promised it in words. He had promised it by nodding once, when she looked at him, and their mother had died looking satisfied, and that was a contract. The Southern Appalachian Lumber Company had hired Harlan and 2 other cruisers that spring to walk the ridge east of the Oconaluftee and mark the merchantable timber. There was a plan, drawn up in an office in Asheville, to run a spur line up the north fork of a creek that had never had a spur line before, and to take the oak and the poplar and the tulip down out of a country that had never given up its trees before. The plan looked clean on paper. The plan did not know about the ridge. The Cherokee man who came to the base camp on the 3rd morning was named Yonah Wildcat, past 70, tall in a way that only the very old can be tall, thin without being frail, with long white hair that he wore loose against his collar. His face was the color of a river stone that has been in the water a long time. He wore a store-bought jacket over a shirt he had made himself, and he carried a walking stick cut from black gum, and he did not sit down when he was offered a seat. He spoke English cleanly and slowly, the way a man speaks who has learned that the wrong word costs more in English than in his own tongue. He said, "You should not put your line up that hollow." The foreman, a man named Boyd Hensley, 35, red-faced and already tired at 8 in the morning, said, "And why is that?" Yonah Wildcat said, "Because the ridge does not sleep, and it does not like to be woken, and it has been woken twice before in the memory of my grandmother." And both times the mountains answered back. Boyd Hensley laughed, not cruelly, the way men laugh when they don't know what else to do with a sentence. Harlan did not laugh. Harlan was watching Yonah Wildcat's hands, which were perfectly still. Yonah Wildcat looked at Harlan then, not at Boyd. He said, "If you go up, do not answer. Whatever calls, do not answer. The mountains will use your own voice against you. That is the warning. It is the only warning I have." He turned and walked back down the wagon track and did not look behind him when the foreman called out a polite thank you that was really a dismissal, and did not look behind him when a young dog belonging to one of the teamsters began to howl for no reason that any of them could see. The men at the base camp were quiet for a long minute after he had gone. A base camp in that country in April is a busy place. Mules being harnessed, chain being coiled, coffee being poured out of a blue enamel pot into cups that had been dented and redented for 15 seasons, and for a full minute none of that motion happened. The teamsters stood. The cook stood. A young clerk from the Asheville office named Radford Beam, 24, thin, wearing a suit that did not belong in a base camp, stood with a pencil frozen above his ledger. Boyd Hensley was the one who moved first. He picked up his coffee. He drank from it. He looked at Harlan across the top of the cup and did not say what he was thinking. Harlan did not say what he was thinking either. What Harlan was thinking exactly was this: that the old man's hands had been still, and that the still hands of an old man who has walked a country for 70 years are a piece of evidence more reliable than any compass, and that a careful man should weigh that evidence, and that a careful man now had a choice to make about whether to take his pay this month or hand back the contract and go home and cut cordwood for a widow he already owed his life to. Harlan drank his own coffee. He handed back nothing. That, he would learn to think about later, was the first small failure of his own care. A raven called, then, from the branch of a hickory at the edge of the base camp clearing. Called once. Called again. It was the only bird that had spoken since Yonah Wildcat had opened his mouth. The dog was named Reuben. He was a red-bone hound, 2 years old, with a good nose and a friendly disposition and a habit of leaning against the nearest human leg. That morning, after Yonah Wildcat walked away, Reuben sat down at the edge of the wagon track and pointed his nose up the ridge and howled the way hounds howl when they have treed something they are afraid of. He howled for a full minute. Then he went and hid under the cook wagon and would not come out until his owner dragged him out by the collar, and even then he trembled. I want you to remember Reuben. Hold the picture of that dog in your mind. He is going to tell you, in his body, everything the men refused to hear. They went up on the 4th day. Harlan and 2 other cruisers and Boyd Hensley the foreman, and a young axeman named Elbert Coyne, 19, with a boy's shoulders that hadn't filled in yet and a father waiting on him back in Cosby. They took Reuben because Reuben belonged to Elbert's uncle and Elbert's uncle had insisted, and they took a mule named Patience, and they carried a week of provisions and a compass and a chain and a ledger. The first day on the ridge the compass worked. The second day, the compass worked in the morning and did not work in the afternoon. It didn't spin. It didn't do anything dramatic. It simply pointed at a stand of chestnut oak that was clearly, plainly, verifiably to the east, and the needle called it north, and no matter which way you turned the case, the needle called that same stand north. You could walk 50 feet in any direction and the compass still pointed at that stand of oak. Harlan wrote it down in the ledger. He wrote it down twice because he did not want to be a man who saw a thing and did not write it down. He underlined it. And then, because he was a careful man, he set the compass on a flat stone and walked 20 paces away and came back, and the needle was pointing at him. Not at the oaks. At him. The mountains answer what you bring them. That is the phrase Yonah Wildcat had used on the wagon track when Boyd Hensley wasn't listening. Harlan had been listening. Harlan wrote that down too. He wrote it once in a small hand at the top of a fresh page. He didn't underline it. He didn't need to. The mountains answer what you bring them. The 3rd day was quiet, and quiet was the wrong kind of quiet. There were no birds above a certain elevation. Not none in the whole world, not none in the trees below, but none above the little bench of open ground where they had made camp. You could stand at the edge of the bench and look down and hear the wood thrush singing its waterdrop song 100 feet below you, and you could turn around and take 3 steps back into the camp and there was nothing. Nothing overhead, nothing in the underbrush, nothing except the mule chewing at her tether and Reuben, who had stopped eating. Elbert Coyne, the 19-year-old, asked if the mule was sick. Harlan said the mule was not sick. Elbert asked if the dog was sick. Harlan said the dog was not sick. Elbert asked what was wrong then, and Harlan looked at the boy and did not answer, because he did not have an answer that would help a 19-year-old sleep. The second cruiser, a man named Verlin Ashmore, mid-40s, wiry, with a sunburned neck and a habit of chewing tobacco he had brought from home in a leather pouch, walked the perimeter of the bench that afternoon. He walked it slowly. He was looking for scat, for tracks, for a reason. He was a hunter first and a cruiser second, and he had spent 30 years reading the ground of these mountains the way a preacher reads a Bible. He came back to the fire ring, and he sat down beside Harlan, and he said quietly so the boy would not hear, "There is no sign. No fox. No corn. No deer. No turkey. No mice. No snake. No spider webs across the trail. Harlan, there are no spider webs. In April. In these mountains." Harlan wrote that down in the ledger. He wrote it in a small hand because a small hand is what a careful man uses when he is writing something he does not want to be true. Verlin Ashmore did not say anything else that afternoon, and he did not eat his supper, and he slept with his rifle across his chest, which was not a thing he had done in 20 years of camping out. On the 4th day they heard the first voice. It came from upslope, from the direction of a rock face they had marked the day before as unclimbable. It was a woman's voice, calling a name none of them recognized, calling it 3 times, the way a mother calls a child in from a field at dusk. The men stopped in the middle of a step. Boyd Hensley, the foreman, opened his mouth to answer, because that is what a man does when he hears a woman calling. A man answers, a man goes to help, and Harlan reached out and put his hand flat over Boyd's mouth. Harlan said quietly, "Don't." Boyd Hensley pulled away, angry, and then heard the voice call again, from a different direction now, from below them, from the direction they had come, calling the same name in the same tone. And he understood then, all at once, the way a man understands the ice is thin only when he hears it crack under him, and he did not open his mouth again for the rest of that day. The mountains answer what you bring them. Reuben pressed himself against Elbert's leg and would not be moved. Patience the mule laid her ears flat against her skull and would not lift them again for 2 hours. The third cruiser, a soft-spoken man named Asaph Cruz, about 60, with a white mustache and a limp from an old accident with a peavey, had said very little during the first 3 days on the ridge. He was the oldest man in the party, and he had cruised these mountains for the Southern Appalachian Lumber Company since before it had been called that, and he had a reputation in the small country of men who did this work for being the last man to spook. That afternoon, after the voices, Asaph Cruz sat down on a fallen chestnut log with his back to the upslope side of the bench, and he took out a small folding knife, and he began, slowly and carefully, to whittle. He whittled for 2 hours. He whittled a small, plain, wooden cross, about the length of his thumb. He put the cross in his shirt pocket, over his heart, and he did not take it out for the rest of the trip. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. Every other man in the party saw him do it, and every other man understood. They cut the day short. They came back down to the bench and made camp early and built a fire that was too large for the amount of wood available, because a large fire is a thing men build when they are afraid and don't want to say the word. Harlan wrote in the ledger. He wrote down the time the voice was first heard, which was 10:14 in the morning by his pocket watch, and the direction and the words as best he could reconstruct them, and then, at the bottom of the entry, he wrote, "Do not answer. I want you to sit with that for a moment." 5 grown men and a boy of 19 and a dog and a mule, on a bench of open ground east of the Oconaluftee, in the year 1907, with a fire burning too hot and nothing overhead, and a compass in the pocket of the head cruiser that could not be trusted, and a written warning at the bottom of a ledger page in a careful hand, in graphite that would still be legible 60 years later when the ledger was rediscovered in a barn in Swain County. Do not answer. That night, none of the men truly slept. They took watches in pairs, without discussing it, the way men who have been in bad weather at sea take watches in pairs. Harlan and Verlin took the first. Boyd and Asaph took the second. Elbert was too young to be given a watch, though he asked. Harlan told him, quietly, that his job was to keep Reuben calm, and Reuben's job was to keep him calm, and that was watch enough. Elbert accepted this the way a boy accepts an assignment from a man he has begun to trust more than his own father. He lay down beside the fire with Reuben under one arm. He was asleep within 10 minutes. Harlan looked across the fire at Verlin and did not say what he was thinking, which was that a boy who falls asleep that easily on a night like this one is a boy the mountain has not yet reached for. Not yet. That night, Elbert Coyne dreamed of his father. He dreamed his father was standing at the edge of the fire, closer than a man could stand to a fire like that, and his father was calling him by his childhood name, which was Bertie, which nobody had used since Elbert was 11 years old. Elbert woke up with his mouth already forming the word Papa, and Harlan was there, kneeling beside his bedroll, with his hand over Elbert's mouth the same way he had put his hand over Boyd Hensley's. Harlan said nothing. He only held his hand there until Elbert's eyes cleared. Then he took his hand away. Elbert said, in a small voice, it sounded like him. Harlan said, it always does. That's the point. Elbert began to cry. Not loudly. The way a boy cries when he is trying not to. Reuben came over and pressed against him and did not leave him for the rest of the night. Have you ever known, in your body before your mind caught up, that something was wrong? That a room was wrong, or a road was wrong, or a house you had loved as a child had turned in some quiet way against you? That is what the mountain was that night on the bench above the Oconaluftee. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just wrong in the body first, the way ice is wrong when you step on it and it holds and in the same breath that it is not going to hold long. Let's go back to the story. On the 5th day they tried to leave. They packed the mule at dawn. Reuben was already trembling. The plan was simple. Down the wagon track, back to the base camp, back to Boyd Hensley's office in Bryson City, back to the man in Asheville who had drawn the plan. The plan was a good plan. It was a careful plan. Harlan had drawn a fresh map the night before from memory and from the compass readings that had still been good, and he had marked the wagon track with a red pencil, and he had noted 3 landmarks along it. A lightning-struck poplar, a boulder split into 3 parts, a little wooden bridge over a nameless branch. They walked for 4 hours down the wagon track. They passed no lightning-struck poplar. They passed no split boulder. They passed no wooden bridge. They walked for another 2 hours. The sun, which should have been at their back, was in their face. Harlan stopped them. He set the compass on a flat stone the way he had before, and he walked 20 paces away and came back. The needle was pointing at him. Boyd Hensley said, "This is not possible." Harlan said, "It is possible. We are in it. The mountains answer what you bring them." Elbert Coyne, 19, sat down in the middle of the wagon track and did not stand up again for a long time. Reuben pressed against him. Patience the mule stood with her ears flat. Asaph Cruz, the old cruiser with the white mustache and the folding knife, did not sit down. He stood at the edge of the wagon track and he looked out into the woods, and he took the small wooden cross out of his shirt pocket, and he held it in his hand for a full minute without speaking. Then he put it back. He said, to no one in particular, "I have been in country before that did not want me. I have never been in country before that had learned my name." It was the longest sentence Asaph Cruz had said in 3 days. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. Verlin Ashmore, the hunter, spat once into the dirt of the wagon track and said softly, "Then let's not give it any more of our names to learn." And that, more than the compass and more than the voices, was the sentence that got them moving again. Yonah Wildcat had said on the wagon track that first morning that the mountains had been woken twice before in the memory of his grandmother. He had not told them what happened the 2 other times. Harlan wished, then, in the middle of a wagon track that did not lead anywhere, that he had asked. But he had not asked because he had been a careful man, and a careful man does not ask a question he isn't ready to hear the answer to, and he had not been ready that morning, and now he was ready, and Yonah Wildcat was 10 miles and 100 years away. The plan had been a good plan. The plan had been a careful plan. And the mountain had taken the plan away from them the way a strong current takes in or out of a hand, and now they had to do a thing at dusk that they had meant to do at noon, and they had to do it without a map and without a compass and without the sun where it belonged. They started walking again. Not down the wagon track, because the wagon track did not lead anywhere. Down the creek. Every creek in these mountains goes to a bigger creek, and every bigger creek goes to a river, and every river has a road along it eventually. That was the new plan. It was a worse plan. It was the only plan they had. They walked along the creek for the rest of the 5th day. The voices started again in the middle of the afternoon. They called from upslope and downslope. They called in a woman's voice and a man's voice and a boy's voice. Twice, they called in Harlan's own voice. Once, they called in Boyd Hensley's own voice from a spot 10 feet behind Boyd Hensley, and Boyd Hensley did not turn around because Harlan had told him not to turn around, and because Boyd Hensley was learning, finally, at 35 to listen. The mountains answer what you bring them. Reuben would not walk on his own. Elbert carried him. A grown redbone hound is a heavy dog, and Elbert Coyne, 19, was not a heavy young man, but he carried Reuben for the rest of that day, and Harlan did not offer to take a turn, because he understood that the boy needed the dog against his chest more than the dog needed to be carried. They camped that night against a rock overhang, the kind of place a party of Cherokee hunters might have used 200 years earlier, and in fact had. There were old, faint soot marks on the stone above their fire that were not from any fire they had built and not from any fire built recently. Harlan noticed the soot marks. He did not point them out. Verlin Ashmore, the hunter, noticed them too, and their eyes met once across the fire, and neither of them said a word. Old fire on stone in these mountains is a kind of blessing. It means the place was used and used carefully and used for shelter, and the men who used it walked out of it. Harlan wrote in the ledger in a small hand, "Slept under an old campsite. Others were here. Others walked out. So can we." The voices called for most of the night. They did not call loudly. They called from a distance, from upslope, from a place that could not have been fewer than half a mile away, in a country where half a mile was 100 ridges. They called Harlan's name and Boyd's name and Elbert's name and Verlin's name and Asaf's name and, once, a name Harlan had not spoken aloud since he was a child, which was his mother's private name for him, which nobody living should have known. Harlan did not answer. He wrote it in the ledger. He wrote in the smallest hand he could manage. It knew a name I have not said in 34 years. Do not answer. And beneath that, in the same small hand, twice, the mountains answer what you bring them. The mountains answer what you bring them. On the 6th day they came out of it. They did not come out of it clean. They came out of it into a laurel hell along a branch none of them recognized, and it took them until noon to find a game trail, and it took them until dusk to find a cabin, and the cabin was not one they had seen before, but it had smoke coming from its chimney, and the smoke was gray and clean and smelled like hickory, and it smelled like a thing built by a person who was not the mountain. The woman who came to the door was named Mahalatachet, past 70, small, brown-skinned, Cherokee on her mother's side and Scots-Irish on her father's, with a face lined the way a leaf is lined, and eyes that took in the 5 men and the dog and the mule and understood all of it before anyone had said a word. She wore a long dark skirt and a homespun blouse and a shawl, and she stood in the doorway with a lamp in one hand, and she looked at them and she did not smile. She said, "You came down the wrong side. Come in. Do not tell me anything until you have eaten." They came in. They ate cornbread and beans with fatback and hot coffee that had chicory in it. Reuben ate a bowl of scraps and then lay down in front of the hearth and slept for 11 hours without moving. Patience was put in the small shed behind the cabin and given hay and did not lift her ears for another day. When they had eaten, Mahalatachet sat down across from Harlan Doss, and she said, "Tell me now." Harlan told her. He told her about the compass. He told her about the birds above the bench. He told her about the voices. He told her about the wagon track that did not lead anywhere. He told her about the sun in their face when it should have been at their back. He told her about Yonah Wildcat coming to the base camp on the 3rd morning and giving them the only warning he had. Mahalatachet listened without moving her face. When Harlan was done, she got up and went to a wooden chest at the foot of her bed, and she brought back a small, folded square of hide, and she opened it, and inside was a written word in Cherokee syllabary, in ink that was old but still black, on a scrap of paper that was clearly older than she was. She said, "This is the word you should not have said. This is the word you should not have answered. My grandfather wrote it down for me when I was a girl so that I would know it and so that I would never say it. There are other words. This is the one for that ridge. Do you understand? Harlan said. I did not answer. I told the others not to answer. Wildcat looked at him for a long moment. She said, Then it is not finished. But it is less than it could have been. You brought the boy back. You brought the mule back. You brought the dog back. That is more than the second party brought back, in my grandmother's time. That is more than the first party brought back, further back than that. She stood up then and walked to the window of the cabin and looked out for a long time at nothing any of them could see. When she turned back, her face was softer, and older, and sadder than it had been. She said, My grandmother was a girl of 11 in the summer the second party went up. She remembered them going. She was in the yard of her grandfather's cabin, further down the creek, and she watched them ride past with their mules and their chain and their good clean rifles. She remembered what they looked like. She remembered the color of the lead man's horse. She remembered his voice, calling a joke over his shoulder to the boy behind him. And she said, when she was older, that the mountain called that same voice down out of the hollow for the rest of that summer. Called it with the same joke. Called it, sometimes, at the same hour of the day the lead man had called it in life. My grandmother did not go up. Her grandfather did not go up. Nobody who lived along that creek went up. It took a long time for the mountain to stop practicing that voice. Do you understand what I am telling you? The mountain is not evil. The mountain is only patient. And it has now, in its patience, learned the sound of 5 new voices. 5 new men. And a boy. That is what I am sitting with, when I sit across from you tonight, Mr. Doss. I am sitting with the sound of your voice, up there, being practiced. Boyd Hensley, the foreman, said, What happens now? Wildcat said, Nothing happens now. That is what people do not understand. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you can put in a newspaper. The mountain has your voice now. The mountain will use it. You will not hear it because you are down here, and the mountain only speaks up there. But if anyone goes up, if anyone else answers, the mountain will use your voice to call them. That is how it feeds. It borrowed your voice. It did not take it. There is a difference. Do you understand the difference? Boyd Hensley did not understand the difference. Harlan did. Harlan said, Then no one goes up. Wildcat said, Then no one goes up. They slept there that night. In the morning, Wildcat walked them out to the county road, which was 3 miles from her cabin, on a game trail she had walked so many times it was almost a road itself. She did not go with them all the way. She stopped where the trail met the wagon rut, and she said, Do not send another party up that ridge. Do not send a survey. Do not send a spur line. If you do, I cannot help what happens. I am one old woman. I am not the mountain. Harlan said, I will not send them. She looked at him a long time. Then she said, You will try not to. That is different. But you are a good man to try. She turned and walked back up her game trail, and she did not look behind her. They came out at the crossroads at Ella in the middle of the 7th day. A teamster there recognized Boyd Hensley and gave them a ride down into Bryson City. Reuben rode on Elbert's lap the whole way. Elbert did not put him down even to eat. Now here is where it gets harder. Because in the story I have told you so far, 5 men and a boy and a dog and a mule walked into a place and walked out of it, and a wise old woman in a cabin explained in careful language the rules of the place they had walked into, and the men listened and the men went home. That would be one kind of ending. It would be the kind of ending you could sit with. But the mountain had borrowed a voice. And a borrowed thing is not a gift. Boyd Hensley, the foreman, 35, went back to Asheville and made his report to the man who had drawn the plan. He was honest in the report about the compass, and he was honest about the wagon track, and he was honest in careful language about hearing voices in a country where sound behaves strangely, and he was honest at the end about his recommendation, which was that the spur line not be built up that hollow, and that another route be found, and that the ridge east of the Oconaluftee be left where it was. The man in Asheville read the report. The man in Asheville was named Farrell Whitmire, 58, silver-haired, well-dressed, with hands that had never held a compass in a bad country. He read the report twice. He set it aside. Then he wrote a letter to the head office in Cincinnati, And in the letter he did not mention the voices, and he did not mention the compass, and he did not mention the ridge, and he did not mention Boyd Hensley's recommendation. He mentioned only that the survey had been completed, and that the timber was as advertised, and that a small crew would be dispatched in the spring of 1908 to run the preliminary line. Farrell Whitmire filed his own letter. He filed Boyd Hensley's report in a different drawer. Both files were forgotten in different ways in different places for very different lengths of time. Harlan Doss went home to his cabin outside Bryson City. He put his money in the tin box under Ada's kitchen floorboards. He told Ada, when she asked, that the ridge east of the Oconaluftee had been a difficult cruise. He did not tell her more. Ada was 31 years old by then, still thin as a reed, still gray at the temples too early, and she looked at him a long moment, and she said, "You'll tell me when you're ready." Harlan said, "I don't know if I'll be ready." Ada said, "Then don't tell me. I'll know it from your face." Elbert Coyne went home to Cosby. He kept Reuben. His uncle, who had originally owned the dog, took one look at Reuben and one look at Elbert and said, "The dog stays with you now." Reuben lived to be 14 years old. He never went into the woods above a certain elevation again for the rest of his life. If Elbert took him near a certain kind of ridge, he would sit down and refuse to walk, and Elbert had learned not to argue. Elbert Coyne married a girl from Cosby in 1911. He had 3 sons. He never went back into timber. He worked in a general store, and then he ran the general store, and then his oldest son ran it, and Elbert lived, an ordinary man in an ordinary town, and the only strange thing about him, the only thing his grandchildren would remember later, was that he would not answer a voice calling his name from more than 50 feet away in the woods. He would say gently, "You come here." "I don't call back." Boyd Hensley did not do so well. He drank, and then he drank more, and then he lost his job at the lumber company because Farrell Whitmire had noticed that Boyd could no longer be trusted to keep quiet in company about the ridge east of the Oconaluftee. Boyd married late and unhappily and moved to Knoxville. He kept a small notebook by his bed for the rest of his life, and in that notebook he wrote, in his own handwriting, the sentence "do not answer" over and over again, some nights half a page of it, some nights only once. His widow gave the notebook to a nephew after his death in 1934, and the nephew, not knowing what to make of it, put it in a box in a barn, where it stayed until the barn was torn down in 1976. Harlan Doss lived to be 73. He never married. He kept sending money to Ada under the kitchen floorboards until Ada's oldest child was grown and married and taking care of her, and then he kept sending it anyway because a man who has made a promise by nodding does not stop keeping it because the person he made it to is comfortable. He worked timber the rest of his life, but only in the low country, and only in stands he had walked before. He wrote in his ledger every day. He kept ledger after ledger. When he died in 1939, his ledgers filled 2 small trunks, and the trunks were given to a cousin who did not read them, and the trunks eventually made their way, by a long path, into the possession of a local historian in the 1960s, who read them and who understood slowly over the course of a winter what he was reading. The historian was the one who went looking for the Bureau of Indian Affairs land report. He found it. It had been filed once. It had been filed once, and then it had been filed again, differently by a different clerk in a different year, with the ridge east of the Oconaluftee marked as unsurveyable. See Field Note 14, and Field Note 14 had been removed at some point from the folder, and no one at the Bureau in the 1960s could tell the historian where Field Note 14 had gone. The historian wrote a letter. The historian wrote 3 letters. Field Note 14 did not turn up. It has still not turned up. If you go looking for it, in the archives that keep such things, you will find the report and you will find the reference to Field Note 14 and you will not find Field Note 14. That is a small, bureaucratic, verifiable fact, and it is one of the reasons I trust the rest of Harlan's ledger. The spring survey party of 1908 went up the ridge east of the Oconaluftee. There were 4 of them. They took a mule and a dog because a mule and a dog are what you take. 2 of them came out. One of them came out and would not speak for 3 months, and when he began to speak again, he was not the same man he had been. One of them did not come out at all, and no body was ever recovered, and the company did not press the matter, because Farrell Whitmire had by then been promoted and did not want the file reopened. The spur line was never run up that hollow. The plan was quietly redrawn to route the line up a different creek, half a mile to the south. The oaks and the poplars and the tulips on the ridge east of the Oconaluftee are still there. Some of them are 300 years old now. The ridge has never been logged. Wildcat lived until 1928. She died in her cabin, in her bed, and a granddaughter found her the next morning with a small folded square of hide clutched in her hand. And inside the hide was a written word in Cherokee syllabary, in ink that was still black, on a scrap of paper older than the granddaughter's mother. The granddaughter did not know what the word was. Her grandmother had never told her. The granddaughter took the hide and put it away in a cedar chest, and it stayed there, and the granddaughter died in her turn, and her daughter kept the chest, and the chest is still in a house near Cherokee, North Carolina. The word is still folded inside. The ridge is still there. If you go up into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and you know where to look and you talk to the right ranger and he trusts you enough, he will tell you that there is a piece of country east of the Oconaluftee where the compasses go strange, and where the birds are quiet above a certain elevation, and where the rangers themselves do not linger, and where the trails do not go and are not being asked to go. He will not tell you why. He will tell you only that some of the old country is still old country, and that some of the old rules are still old rules, and that the Cherokee elders who advise the park have been consistent over many years on this particular ridge, and the park has, in its slow bureaucratic way, listened. In 1974, a graduate student from a state university tried to run a small research project on the ridge. He wanted to test the compass readings. He wanted to record the sound. He was 26 years old and thorough, and skeptical in the honest way of a man who thinks skepticism is a kind of manners. He obtained a permit. He obtained a guide, an elderly Cherokee man from the reservation who accepted the fee and walked with him to the base of the game trail, and then stopped and refused to go further and refused to explain why and refused also to give the money back, because in his view the fee had covered walking to the base of the trail, and that was what had been done. The graduate student went up alone. He came out 3 days later. He came out with his compass in working order and his recorder full of nothing but wind, and he came out politely refusing to speak about what had happened on the second night. He wrote a short paper and he did not publish it, and he changed his field and he became eventually a very good middle school science teacher in a small town in Indiana, and every October for the rest of his life, he sent an anonymous money order to a small church near Cherokee, North Carolina, that maintained the cemetery of an old woman named Wildcat. Nobody at the church ever asked who was sending it. But every October, without fail until the year the graduate student died, the money order came. Every year in October, a certain woman in Cherokee, North Carolina, who is Wildcat's great-great-granddaughter, walks up a game trail at dusk with a small pouch of tobacco and a small pouch of cornmeal, and she leaves them at the base of a particular hickory tree, and she does not go past that tree, and she does not stay long. She does this because her grandmother did it, and because her grandmother's grandmother did it, and because a promise was made once in a cabin to a broad-shouldered timber cruiser with iron-gray temples that no one would go up the ridge. She is one old woman. She is not the mountain. But she has kept the tobacco and the cornmeal at the base of the hickory for 41 years without a break, and the ridge, so far, has been content. She told me, when I sat with her, that she does not think of it as fear. She thinks of it as manners. Manners, she said, are the small things you do that keep a house you did not build from falling in on you. The ridge is a house she did not build. The tobacco and the cornmeal are her manners. She said this while pouring me coffee, and while the light through her kitchen window slanted a certain way, and while, somewhere far off, a hound was barking at something ordinary, and I wrote it down in my own small handwriting the moment I got back to my truck, so that I would not lose the exact words, because the exact words were the point. And here, near the end of the story, I want to ask you again, the way I asked earlier in the firelit part of the telling. If you have a story from your own country, a ridge your family will not cross, a well your grandmother would not draw from, a hollow the old men will not name aloud, I would like to hear it. Send it to me. Write it plainly. Do not make it more dramatic than it was. The plain ones are the ones I trust. And one of them, maybe yours, will become the next story I tell. I want to leave you with something, not a lesson. This kind of story does not have lessons, but a small thing to sit with. Every place you walk in this country was walked before. Every ridge had a name before the map. Every creek had a name before the surveyor. And every one of the old names carried, inside it, a piece of information, a warning or a permission or a way of behaving, that the new names lost. Most of the time, the loss doesn't matter. The land is patient. The land has been patient with us for a long time. But sometimes, in certain places, the land is not patient, and it is not forgiving, and it is not going to explain itself to a man in an office in Asheville with a plan drawn up on paper. Yonah Wildcat came down to a base camp on a morning in April of 1907 and gave a warning. The warning was ignored by the man it was given to. It was not ignored by the man beside him. Because of that small difference, because one man listened and one man did not, 5 people and a dog and a mule came back down out of a country they should not have come back down out of. That is the whole story. That is why I tell it. Not because the mountain is scary. The mountain is not scary. The mountain is old, and it is honest, and it will tell you exactly what it is if you let it. But because a warning was given and a man listened, and that is a rarer thing than any haunting. If you have a story from your own country, from a ridge your grandfather would not cross, from a creek your grandmother would not let you swim in, from a word in an old language nobody speaks anymore that your family still whispers when the wind picks up, I would like to hear it. Send it to me. Tell me where you're from and what the old name of the place is, and what your family did or did not do there. I read every one, and one of them, maybe yours, will become the next story I tell. I have my eye on one already from a listener in southern Ohio, about a bend in a river where the fish come up dead in July every year and no one can say why. I will get to that one soon. But for tonight, this is the story I owed, and this is where I set it down. Do not answer. If a voice you love calls from a place a voice you love should not be, do not answer. Wait, go closer if you have to go closer. Look with your eyes. Trust your dog. Trust your mule. Trust the old woman in the cabin who does not smile when she opens the door. And when the ridge asks you a question in your own voice, because it will eventually ask you a question in your own voice, let the silence be your answer. Be the one who does not answer back.